Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Procurement Summit meeting. My name is Sandra, and I will be moderating today's call. Our speaker today is Mark Chadwick, Executive Sourcing Leader, Logistics, GE Corporate Global Ops, and President of the Global Shippers Association, presenting Shippers' Response to Evolving Ocean Market Reality. We will turn to the presentation in just a moment, but first I want to go over the web conference instructions. Everyone is currently in mute so that the background noise does not become distracting for the other participants. To view today's presentation as the screens change live, you may go to the link that was sent to you in your reminder email. Once in there, you may click anywhere on the page. Everyone see the pop-up with the option to make a comment? Feel free to ask questions by clicking on any slide, and we'll make sure all of your questions are answered. For the newer participants in the group, it might be useful to review some of the main benefits you can take advantage of as a member at no additional charge. First are the live monthly web conference meetings, which you've already dialed into today. I hope you find these useful, and we have an excellent lineup, which you can see by going to our website's schedule page. Second, we do record all of these, so if you are traveling or stuck in another meeting, simply log in at your leisure, and the full archives of past meetings are available to you with a number of interesting topics. Third, get to know the other members. By logging in, you can see all of their profiles, and we are glad to make any introductions if wished. Fourth, if you are wrestling with any key issues or decisions, we strongly encourage you to reach out to the other members. Also, our site makes it very easy to post questions. The seniority and experience of your fellow members makes this the best possible forum to get advice from others who have probably dealt with the same issues and can give you sound advice on what worked and what did not. Fifth, we really encourage site visits. If you have not visited others' offices to have a great discussion on best practices and see their facilities, please do so. You can log in to see the other members' companies and cities, so feel free to reach out, or, as mentioned, we are happy to make introductions. Sixth, we also generate executive summaries of meetings, including the key takeaways and learning nuggets, so that you can reference them and put them right into action. Seventh, our members are very busy, so we started a service where we pick out the top 6 most interesting articles among thousands at hundreds of sites to keep you abreast and ensure you don't miss the key ones. Lastly is our Book of the Month summary that you can either read or listen to as you commute. Each month we will be selecting the most interesting book, then summarizing the ideas so within minutes you can absorb the key takeaways. There are many other benefits, of course, but I just wanted to highlight some and keep a lookout in your inbox for a number of these each month. That takes care of the housekeeping items. If you'll just give me a few moments to now pull up the speaker's presentation and introduce him. Okay, all set. Now, before I turn the call over, I would like to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Mark is currently the Executive Sourcing Leader for Logistics at GE Global Operations and President of the Global Shippers Association. He's located at the GSA headquarters in Fort Myers, Florida. In 2002, he was promoted to Lead Logistics for Plastics Europe, relocating to Bergen op Zoom in the Netherlands. He transferred to GEHC in 2005 to lead logistics for EMEA based at GEHC headquarters in the UK. You may read Mark's full bio sent to you in your reminder email. Mark, thank you so much for being with us today. Just say next when you wish the slides to advance, and the floor is all yours.
Great, thank you. Well, hopefully we'll keep this fairly light. It's a pretty heavy topic with the current state of the ocean market, but I'll try and keep it fairly light. This is a shipper's view. I'm not an economist. Just some of the highlights, some of the things that we've been thinking through, and hopefully that'll be helpful to you. So if we go to the next slide. Can you do the next slide?
Yeah, you may have to refresh. Try refreshing.
Okay. Let's give it a go. Okay, got it. Thank you. Right, so just to give you a little bit of context about the GSA, obviously folks are familiar with General Electric, but the GSA was founded 25 years ago. It's a not-for-profit. It's basically a vehicle to be able to pull together a number of different shippers so that we can procure logistics together rather than individually. So when G negotiates an ocean freight contract, it's a GSA contract basically, which would include all the companies that you see here on the page. And the great advantage of that has been that we've been able to boost our leverage. Obviously, the spend is significantly greater of all these companies together as we go to the shipping lines. So we've got that collective leverage. We've streamlined our negotiation process. Contract support is provided by the GSA, so all of the members get the benefit of that and don't have to write their own contracts with the carriers. We have best practice sharing. It's been a good group, and again, nobody's trying to make a profit, so the costs are shared amongst the members, which keeps them very low. And we've been doing that, like I say, 25 years. We've been working together, and it's been very successful. So the view I'm going to give you is the view of the GSA, not necessarily G or any of these individual members, but the collective GSA group. So if we go to the next slide. I thought this was a great snapshot. Obviously, carrier consolidation started before 2015. We've seen Hanjin go bankrupt in these last few years. We've seen a lot of changes, a lot of acquisitions, mergers, lots of changes in the alliances and how these lines are kind of working together. But you can see, I think it's pretty clear how things have consolidated over the last few years. And as we look at 2019 and beyond, I think one of the changes is going to be Hyundai will be leaving the 2M+H. But aside from that, we just see everything kind of coming together, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's some upside to that, but there's certainly some downside too. And so we felt that there's no way, if the GSA has been working for 25 years, we can't operate the same way we did 25 years ago or even 5 years ago. We've got to acknowledge that the market's changed, that the way we interact with the carriers has to change as well. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit here in a moment. So if we go to the next slide. So, I don't know overplay this one, but there are some clear comparisons with the air alliances. Just like as you book an airplane ticket with Delta, the flight might be an Air France flight that you actually get on. Same with ocean, with these alliances. You could be booking a Maersk container and it end up on an MSC vessel. Some benefits, just like with passenger side of things. This helps the carriers keep costs down, maximize the load that they're putting onto these vessels, maximize utilization, really be able to offer maybe a broader portfolio of sailings to the shippers. So there's some definite benefits there. But overall, I mean, there's still this concern of, is this going to end up long-term meaning higher cost? Is it going to help the carriers be bolder as they set capacity constraints? And I think we've seen some of that, especially last year in peak season, and as there was the rush to beat the initial tariffs that were being announced. There was plenty of capacity in the market, but some of that capacity had been artificially removed by the carriers to drive pricing up. I mean, the one big difference between the airlines and the carriers, of course, is that the airlines make their money on passengers and cargo's kind of gravy that they add on, whereas with the ocean lines, there are no passengers on these vessels as yet. Maybe that's something they could look into, but, joking aside, they have to make money on the ocean containers. And when you look at the financials, they've been in bad shape for a long time. I mean, if there's rumors of an impending recession, the carriers are not going to do well. There's not been a significant recovery for the carriers since the Great Recession. You still see that in the last few years. There'll be a year where they make a profit, not a fantastic profit, but at least a profit, followed up by a year where they make a staggering loss for the year. And if you look at that trend overall, since even just before the recession, they've been in bad shape for over 10 years now. So we're somewhat concerned what that means. I think the Z-scores, kind of looking at the financials for the carriers, is becoming more and more important. You don't want to be on a vessel, and this is, I think, what some people learn with Hanjin. Maybe you've avoided Hanjin, but if you end up loading with a carrier that is in that same alliance, your containers could well be on a ship of a carrier that's going bankrupt. So when we look at carrier selection, we kind of prefer, we're kind of giving a preference certainly to the ones with a good financial outlook, and also ones that are in an alliance where there are no kind of rogue carriers that could go under and could end up having some of our cargo on board. So it's an important consideration. I think we're all for the carriers saving cost. So these alliances, that aspect of them are certainly good, as long as that's being passed on as well to the customers. But yeah, definite concerns with alliances in general and where the industry is heading at the moment. Let's go to the next slide. And we can go to the next one. So we've looked at three different models, basically going direct to the carrier, which is what we've traditionally done. We do annualized negotiations based on trades. So we do Trans-Pacific at one time, and we do Transatlantic in a separate event. We could do one global event, but frankly, just too much volume. So we split into 2 or 3 different trades. But we go direct to the carriers. There's some big pros to that. Obviously, they're the asset owners. There's some price stability there. We can lock in rates for a year. We can avoid peak season surcharges by having that clearly laid out in contracts, and try and build a relationship direct with the carriers. I think some of the cons, I'm not sure about your experience, but if I compare the experience I have with my air freight forwarders to working with the ocean carriers, there's a massive difference. Customer service customers almost seem to be a necessary evil that the carriers put up with to keep in business, but no real focus on the customer. And this is general. I'd say this is pretty much across the board. There's 1 or 2 exceptions of carriers that are really trying to change that in the last maybe 6 months to a year. But overall, customer service is pretty poor, and no real interest in changing that. It caused me in some of my carrier meetings to really raise the questions. Are you still interested in doing business direct with shippers? If we look at how we manage air freight, the airlines in general, don't really want to deal with the shippers, and so we go through freight forwarders. So are ocean carriers looking to do the same? And the answer I always get back is no. They want the relationships direct with the shippers, but they're short-staffed and they struggle to meet demanding customer needs like ourselves. They struggle with that. So difficult. We like working direct with the carriers, but there's some definite issues there with customer service. So if we go to the next one. So the alternative was that looking at, one of the alternatives, looking at this forwarder model of saying, okay, the carriers can say that they want to work with me, but I'm not seeing that when a container gets rolled, or when it's difficult to find out where a container is, get it released from a port. But working with an air freight forwarder, those service providers have a lot more skin in the game. We may spend with on ocean freight, I think at least the GE spends a few $100 million on ocean freight, but we spend way more than that on air freight. And so if I'm going to potentially use, say, an Expeditors or a DHL for my ocean freight, I've got the benefit that I'm also a customer for air freight, so they're going to be nicer to me than if I was just giving them ocean freight business, and hopefully that gets me some extra attention. The other side of that, some of these forwarders have massive volumes. If you look at companies like Schenker, DHL, we're talking of millions of TUs a year. DSA is pretty big at 300,000, but DHL, I think last year cleared 3 million TUs. So in principle, you'd expect them to be able to get better rates. What we've seen is the forwarders want to make a margin, so they'll get a good rate from Hapag-Lloyd, but if they throw $100, $150 on an ocean freight container, in ocean freight, that's big. That puts them out of the running, makes them more expensive. You lose the connection of working directly with the asset holders. And although in our forwarder contracts we've stipulated no peak season surcharges, in many cases the forwarders then are taking it on the chin because their contracts with the carriers don't line up with ours. And once the forwarder's losing so much money, that it's becoming unviable, then there's certainly some reluctance to pick up containers, and it could create an issue. So there's some cons there too. We go to the next slide. We tried this hybrid approach. We kept the trade set up annual contracts. We introduced 2 or 3 forwarders into the mix. So we worked with about, I think it's 10 ocean carriers, and we added 3 freight forwarders into the same negotiation, treated them as MBOCCs, sent them the same RFQ the carriers are getting, had the same negotiation, just to try and test out this model to see if they could compete. What we found is what I kind of alluded to on the prior page. If we bring in 10 carriers and 3 forwarders, we were finding that often the carriers were giving us better rates than we were able to get from the forwarders. And this was partly due to the margin that the forwarders were adding, and partly to do with the fact that I think when the carriers hit a certain level of volume, driving to a certain price, if it's $1,000 for 300,000 TUs, for 2 million TUs, it's not getting much cheaper than that. And so we weren't really seeing the benefit of the carrier's bigger leverage. What we've started to see, and I kind of thought that long term we would, we'd really have more forwarder engagement. But what we started to see this year was interesting as well. Bunker surcharges, and bunker obviously we'll talk about in a moment. Bunker's going to be more and more of an issue in the next 6 months, next year, with the IMO 2020. But if the forwarders lock in a deal with me at a rate that on bunker surcharge that could be very different to what they have with the carriers are still going to hit them with that increased charge, and there starts to be a big deficit between what the forwarder is able to collect from me and what they're paying out to the carrier. And we saw that with one forwarder this year in this hybrid model. I won't mention the name, but we gave them a sizable award, and they miscalculated how much they were going to get for fuel, and it caused a big gap. And so we've been having some pretty high-level discussions about whether that means they want to come back with a rate adjustment or not. We're pushing back, and we've kind of said, if you do that, that's the last time you get invited to this. We were trying this model, potential to grow business, but if at the first sign of trouble, you're going to back off with your tail between your legs, then it's not for us. And I think that's kind of a learning that we're going to take into the next negotiations. We can cautiously work with forwarders on this, but I don't see us making any big awards to forwarders in the next negotiations that are coming up. I think we're going to focus heavily on the big ocean carriers that are healthy, and I don't want to drop too many names, but I think a company like Maersk, where they've got better financials than many and have so far really tried to turn the corner on customer service. We're going to start favouring more of those big lines, and forwarders I think are still going to be in this hybrid model, but we're going to be cautious because we've seen too many risks there of a big blow up. And if we'd have made an even bigger award to this forwarder, I think they would have pulled away completely. which leaves you exposed in the middle of what could be peak season and, could turn out to be very expensive. If we go to the next page. Refresh again on my side. Okay, and we can go. So I'm just going to talk for a second. We've got one page, talk about what we're doing, just share with you what we're doing about IMO 2020. Big topic, obviously. The great thing with this one is we've seen it coming. It was talked about last year already. We were able to notify our leadership that this is coming down the line. Obviously, initially you get the typical questions about what are you going to do to mitigate, this cost, and we need to push back, and we're not going to accept it. So let's go to the next slide, which is actually the last slide, and I'll talk to you about a little bit. The way we see this, from our perspective at least, we see this cost as inevitably being passed on to shippers. We've talked to the big carriers. We know, we've heard through the grapevine of some big shippers, some of our peers, who've pushed back and said no, and have tried to exclude an increased bunker surcharge for next year from their contracts. And there's been very strict instructions given from C-level management of the carriers that in that case contracts won't be signed. And I know for a fact that Maersk and MSC have walked away from a couple of big customers that refuse to make some concessions. Obviously, we don't want to over-concede, so we've set up a fuel index of our own. We don't, obviously, the ones that the carriers send out, there's a high chance of them being carrier favorable. So we've set up our own metrics. We've based it on the what we think the price of the new fuel is going to be. We've sent that out to the carriers. It's been pretty well received. There was some initial pushback, but they kind of understand where we're going and appreciate the fact there's an index. We expect the price of these new fuels or newly used fuels, they're not new fuels, to really kind of hit a peak in Q1 and early Q2. But hopefully, as the market calms down by Q3, Q4, those prices should start to come down a little bit. So that's why it's been key to have that in an index. We don't, and we're kind of avoiding the all-in rate. So I think going for an all-in rate for 2020 could be a big mistake because the carriers are going to be hedging the worst-case scenario into those rates for fuel if they're negotiating them this year for next year's shipments. And so if you don't have an index, you're really going to be stuck. So we said no. We'll have a fuel surcharge index. This is the one we've sent out to carriers. All carriers are going to get the same. As the market goes up, unfortunately, we'll be paying more for the fuel surcharge. But as it comes down, likewise, we'll see that money come out. We want the bottom line number that we pay to the carriers to be fair, but to be the absolute best that we can get. And we've found that the index is going to be one way of achieving that. Right now, we're expecting, and these numbers, these are estimates. We're expecting the impact to be between $100 and $150 per TEU. So at the top end of that scale, I mean, that could be $300 on a 40-foot container. It's going to be a pretty significant impact. Now, playing kind of in, well, I wouldn't, saying in our favor is probably not the right term. Obviously, a weaker global economy is not something that any of our companies really want. But from a procurement perspective, the weaker market could play in our favor somewhat in terms of pricing. And while we may pay more on an index, for fuel, if the market stays fairly slow, we could expect to see slightly better ocean freight rates, which would offset a little bit of that fuel impact. But the bottom line here, we felt we need to be fair. This is a cost that's being imposed on the carriers. It's to the benefit of humanity. We've got one of our, in fact, it's funny, one of the businesses that really pushed back to me was the G Renewables business that make wind turbines and all these, kind of energy friendly, clean energy products. And we push back, say, hey, this is for the environment. That kind of fits with the ethos of where the company's headed. So, we're going to have to do our part, and that's going to mean paying potentially up to $300 for a 40-foot container above what we paid this year. We hear a lot about scrubbers, but I think this graph that Goldman Sachs put out, this clearly shows that at least for the next couple of years, scrubbers are going to be there, but they're even out to 2025. It's not going to be the lion's share of the volume of what these vessels use to treat the fuel. And on the topic of scrubbers, the open system scrubbers basically just take out all the pollutants and dump them into the sea instead of to the air. So yeah, the oceans are big, but I'm not sure that from an environmental perspective, any of us are big supporters of dumping all this pollution into the ocean instead of into the air. And those closed circuit scrubbers really are expensive and a big drain on carriers. And so we don't expect to see a lot of closed circuit scrubbers being fitted onto vessels. So for the most part, we're expecting low sulfur fuels and diesel to be used. There's been some talk about liquefied natural gas, and there are some vessels out there. But from a capacity point of view, it's very, very small. And as you look out to 2025, it's a small sliver of what's going to be out there. So by far the new norm is going to be diesel or low sulfur fuel equivalents. And you can see the change there. I mean, it already starts to happen towards the end of 2019 with full effect on 2020. One question we get asked a lot is about enforcement. Will there be heavy enforcement of this? We think so. We think there's potential for inspections of these vessels at ports, and if insurance companies stop providing insurance to vessels that are burning, or are caught burning these fuels that aren't approved anymore, there's going to be serious consequences. So while we think that probably for the first few months of 2020, enforcement may be somewhat light-handed and not too intense, we expect that by Q2 it's going to be very intense. And so most of the carriers that we deal with are going to be, by January 1st, they're going to be 100% compliant. And I think for most of our companies, that's the kind of company you want to deal with. If this is a global regulation, we want to comply, and we don't want to be associated with carriers that could kind of bend the rules to save money here. So that's our approach. Index is going to be the way we go forward. We think it's fair. We're taking it on the chin a little bit. We're going to already start paying a small increase in Q4 in preparation for Q1, and then we'll take the full index as of January 1st in 2020. So that brings us to the end. I mean, it's a quick view, basically, of what we're doing for the GSA. Again, as a quick recap, we're going to try and partner more and more with carriers. As part of that, I travel to the carriers' headquarters and meet with them there to try and make sure there's a good, strong relationship going forward. We still make them compete in a competitive negotiation environment, but we really want to build some partnerships. Without these ocean carriers, none of our businesses are going to be able to operate. So we need them to be seeing us as partners that pay an aggressive price, but at the end of the day, a fair price for the services that we ask. And I think being one of the first to set up an index for this new fuel, I think has been key to us getting some goodwill there in these partnerships. Okay, and that's it from my side. If there are any questions now, we can take questions now, and also if anyone wants to reach out, I'm available to answer questions via email too. But I'm not sure to the moderator if there's any questions we want to take now.
Thank you, Mark. We really enjoyed your presentation. Before I go out and check the chat line of questions submitted, do we have any live questions? Again, it is *6 to unmute your line and go ahead with your questions, or a reminder that you can also click anywhere on this last slide. Then you will see how to make a comment so you can type your question if wished. So again, any live questions? Okay, Mark, we have received several questions throughout your presentation. Keep in mind you may have touched on these, but I'll ask them all anyway just in case there's something you would like to add to or elaborate on.
Okay.
So our first question, are you starting to rethink the structure of this and do something significantly different since the approach you are taking now has introduced some surprises?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think so, but I think it's along the lines of what I touched on. When we started, and I did a pitch on one of these calls a couple of years ago, I was convinced that forwarders were going to be the way to go. You know, I have a great relationship with some of the big forwarders, and we get to sit down with the CEO of these companies, and you know, it felt like if only I could get that for ocean freight, where the thought of leaving one of my containers at the port would make people's blood turn cold, you know, and they would not even consider it as an option, would bend over backwards to give us everything we need. And like I get when I ship an air freight shipment, or I have a customs brokerage with one of my brokers. And I thought, definitely long term, if the carriers don't care enough about customers and see us just as ship fillers, it's going to be a forwarder model. But you know, we've tried it now for a couple of years. I thought we'd start off with 3, and in the end, it would be so successful that we'd say, okay, let's just work with forwarders. We'll invite a few more forwarders and stop inviting the carriers. And that didn't happen at all. We see risks with those forwarders, as I mentioned before. We see their appetite for absorbing losses on ocean freight as, you know, there's limits to how much they'll take. And so I think the change has been that basically the strategy we had all along of working direct with carriers still seems to be the best. The only tweak being, I don't want to work with 10. I think we should be working with 3 or 4 carefully chosen carriers that are financially stable, or as stable as they could be, and show at least some signs of wanting to engage in a partnership. And so that's I guess the big change.
Okay, thank you. Now our next question, have the carriers ever tried to develop something like this, or have all efforts been on the shipper side?
And I'm not sure if that question's in relation to the fuel surcharge. I guess it's more around from the procurement side. The alliances. What's been interesting is the alliances, although they're not allowed to negotiate collectively. So they still come to us individually. So Maersk and MSC might be on the same ship, but the pricing I'm getting for the same lane, even though that container could be on the exact same vessel, the pricing I'm getting is completely different, and sometimes different by 20-30%, which is mind-blowing, but it's definitely happening. You know, back 10-15 years ago, there was concern about collusion by the carriers, and I think they've tried really hard to stay away from that and make clear, or at least give the impression that that's not happening. You know, from a pricing point of view, we definitely see them operate very independently. From a capacity point of view, though, I mean, sometimes I'm concerned that some of these vessels, you'll see containers being left behind in the port because the vessel's full. Actually, the vessel wasn't full. There's just the carriers blocked off a portion of the vessel as full, when in fact it was empty, but it was done to create artificial an artificial balance between demand and capacity to keep rates high. Now, I'm not alleging that there's any collusion there, but that certainly seems a little bit strange and not something that we appreciate. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. And now our last question. How hard is it to get consensus among the shippers involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually sometimes easier to get it's harder to get the GE companies to be on the same page than it is some of these other independent companies. But yeah, it's pretty hard because obviously everyone's got their own needs. If you look at the one of the initial pages, you've got Bose. There's very different needs to GE appliances, very different from Quicksilver or Board Riders, who are a clothing company. So it's not easy, but I think what's helped us is they see the benefits. So they see the benefit of having to make some compromises here and there, and maybe doing the negotiation in a style that works for most. They adapt to that because they see the benefits from a price point of view and also from service. Going to the carriers individually, these carriers are so big now. After all the consolidation they've been through, even the GSA, 300,000 containers, pretty big volume, but still, they could live without us if they had to. So the members have seen the benefit of working together, of joining forces, and thankfully, for the most part, they leave their personal preferences behind and help reach a consensus. And all of the members make some sacrifices to achieve that, but at the end of the day, the numbers are what do the talking. They see the benefit. They see what they'd be facing if they were on their own. And so, that's kind of what gets everyone on the same page.
All right, Mark, I think we have covered everyone's questions. Do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom you would like to share before we end our summit today?
Yeah, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you. It's an exciting industry, logistics industry. Ocean freight's, I wouldn't say it's fun, but there's certainly some ups and downs. I'm a real advocate for partnership. We're tough with the carriers. We drive a hard bargain, but we really want a good relationship. We want to be respectful. And when something like this IMO 2020 comes up, we think that's an opportunity for us to say, okay, yes, these are tough negotiations, but we're going to take a stand here and give you something fair to compensate, at least in part, for this fuel. And it's been very well received. So my word of wisdom would be really to encourage seeking out that partnership with carriers that are worthy of partnership, and not all of them are, but it's identifying those carriers and trying to build a solid relationship really goes a long way, especially when capacity gets tight. We saw that when Hanji went bankrupt. We had thousands and thousands of containers that needed a new home, and we had a couple of carriers that just absorbed that volume and did not take advantage of the situation to increase the rates. They gave us the rates that we had already, and that wouldn't have been the case if they'd have felt abused, and that we weren't treating them as partners. So it can really be a good card to have in your back pocket going forward when there's a crisis situation. Yeah, so that's it. And like I say, if there are any other questions, I'd be happy to receive them offline.
Mark, simply wonderful thoughts. On behalf of all of the executives on the line, I would like to thank you for sharing such powerful ideas and key thoughts with us today. Your involvement and dedication to our profession sets a high benchmark for others to follow. For all of the participants on today's call, thank you for your continued membership and insightful questions for today's speaker. The meeting is now officially concluded. Mark, thank you so much again, and everyone have a great day.
Great. Thanks very much. Thank you. Have a good day.